My name's Mike Kenn. Actually Michael, but I go by Mike. I was born February 9th, 1956, Evanston, Illinois. My parents grew up in the Depression, and my dad was the son of a Polish immigrant. He was born in a farmhouse in Battle Creek, Michigan. So we were blue collar. My dad never graduated from high school. My mom did. My dad actually broke his hand. It was going to flunk typing, so he was not going to graduate because he was going to flunk a class because he couldn't type. So he enlisted in the Army. He right at the end of the Korean War and at the end of the World War II. So he was both a Korean War veteran and a World War II veteran, but he didn't see any combat in either theater. I didn't know that until he died, that he was a veteran in both wars, but he just kind of fell right in the middle in between both of them. Very self-sufficient family. You know, when you grow up in the Depression, you learn to have to do everything for yourself, which even means put food on the table. So his brothers would hunt squirrels and rabbits and things like that because they couldn't afford to buy meat. And you had to learn to fix everything yourself. So, and that, reflecting back is a strong influence is being self-sufficient and learning how to take care of things for yourself and not relying on other people, because we never had a repairman in our house ever until they switched the TV to color from tubes to circuits. And my dad didn't know how to fix the color TV, and we had to bring somebody in to fix that. But it didn't matter if it was electrical, carpentry, plumbing, air conditioning, automotive. We learned how to do it all. Now, I'm not as good as a mechanic as my two brothers are, but we all basically were raised the same way, is that we all know how to do everything relatively well. My mom worked, and when my dad came back from the war, he went up to Wisconsin with an Army buddy of his and drove a beer truck around Wisconsin delivering beer, and then came back to the Chicago area and got a job at a company called Climatempt. He was their first employee. He would do ventilation system and gutters, and there was a first job he was on, and Vic Conforti was the owner of the company. It's a funny story, I'll tell it. And Dad's up on a ladder putting these gutters on the house, and Vic comes by and says, "Hey, Leo, what are you doing?" "What do you mean, Vic? I'm putting the gutters on the house." I says, "I know you are, Leo, but you're putting them on the wrong house." So but my dad was their first employee and worked for them for 37 years. He worked from being their first employee to a journeyman to the field superintendent, running all their jobs, the entire field. And there would be times when they had 500 or 600 guys on the job. They were the largest ventilating contractor in the Midwest. They would do jobs like O'Hare Field, and my dad ran all the people in the field. But my dad was mechanically very smart, and he had really good intuition too. It was really interesting. Here's a guy that didn't have a high school, didn't even graduate from high school, never went to college, and they would have a ventilation job on a building that was maybe $12 or $15 million, which was pretty big for back then. And the engineers would go ahead and do the schematics and lay it all out and everything. And then they'd walk down the hall to my dad and they say, "Leo, tell us what you think about this." And he'd go, "All right, you need to change this, do this, move this over here, do that, and everything like this. It'll save us $2.5 million and it'll work better." And they go, "Okay, Leo, thanks." And then they walk out. And so that's the kind of person my dad was. So because of that influence too, we never really, and that I think could be seen as a good thing and a bad thing, is that we don't look for help from other people, nor do we ask for help from other people. maybe it's, the Polish heritage. My mom was Irish. I got to make sure I put that in there because I'm Irish, Polish, and Lithuanian. But I guess it's more in our personality that, and I think it's a problem with our youth of today is that they're always looking for somebody to fix their problems. And the way I was brought up, you always had to find a way to take care of it yourself. And that was a huge, huge influencing factor on why I think I've always kind of gravitated towards the leadership position, to be in front. Because, like I maybe said earlier, I trust myself. I know who I am. And I might think I know who you or somebody else is, but I never really do. And like you being an ex, armed forces guy, the guys you do trust the most are the people you trust the most are the ones you've been in the field of battle with. And football was a sport, and sports are in general, especially football, since it's such a combative sport, is that you know who you can trust on the field of battle. So I also tell my two girls and other young people, it says, you'll be lucky in life if you've got 5 really good friends. And if you got more than 5, which means you can raise your second hand, which means you got somewhere 10 or less, it says you're a very fortunate individual to have friends that are that loyal to you. And luckily I do. In fact, I've got more than 10. But I think it has to do with the area and the era that we grew up in too, because we all came from, Depression parents, and we all learned to do things on our own because we grew into a middle-class family, but we were originally maybe lower middle class to lower class in the beginning. But we made it work, and I didn't know how economically challenged my parents were until I got older. We always had food on the table. We always had clothes on our thing. My dad made it work, and unfortunately he died at a young age, but he died at 67, and my mom was taken care of financially and still is today and has plenty of money, and the house is paid for, and he did that because he was thorough. He always used to say, son, and I always remember this, if you're going to do something, do it right or don't do it. So you're either all in or you're not. Once you make the decision to do it, you're all in, and do it right and finish it right. And once you start something, finish it. Don't retreat or stop. And that's a simple little statement there. If you're going to do something, do it right or don't do it. So I've kind of always been all in on that premise. I was always very tall, but I was always very thin. In fact, my mom used to always take me to our general practitioner back to Dr. Murphy, and she used to always ask him, he says, why is my boy so skinny? He says, there's something wrong with him. And she used to tell Mom, who goes by Sis, he's fine, don't worry about it. He says, how's his appetite? He says, she says, I can't feed him enough. And so, but this was an annual thing, and she was always concerned. And I went to a parochial Catholic grade school, St. Mary's. Started to play football there when I was in 5th grade, so at 10 years old. They tried to get me to play basketball, which I did, but I wasn't very coordinated at that time and just couldn't. But I was, as an 8th grader, I was already 5'11", so you got to play basketball. We never won a game in grade school in football in 4 years. Maybe it had something to do that we wore powder blue uniforms. So, but we never won a game. And then there was one big public high school in Evanston Township High School. And even Skokie, the neighboring city, didn't have a public high school. So, and that high school had been there for quite some time. In fact, my dad went to high school there. And we had over 5,000 kids in attendance. In fact, our graduating class when I graduated was 1,200 kids. Went there and went out for the football team just like all my other friends did. And I was, I think, 6'4" at the time. Gosh, I maybe weighed 145 pounds. And it was an interesting way that they conducted their evaluations back then. Is they would do all these non-equipment drills, running, things like that. And those who excelled the best are the ones who got to pick from the equipment, because we had like 120 guys go out for the team, but we didn't have an abundance of equipment. So who they evaluated over a 4-day period, and they were the ones who got to pick the best equipment. Well, I was in the last group that got to pick from the equipment. And I was an offensive and a defensive lineman, and so there wasn't much left. And there was a helmet that had a 2-bar face mask and a bull ring, which is usually not worn by an offensive or a defensive lineman. But that's all they had left. And then we put the equipment on, and we started to actually do contact drills. And for some reason, and maybe it was because, I was very light, even though I was very tall, I knew that the only way I was going to be successful playing was that I had to be in a leverage winning position. So we ran this drill, a one-on-one line blocking drill, me as the offensive lineman. And I was dominating the drill to the point where they kept putting another defensive lineman and another defensive lineman and another defensive lineman in, until the point where it says, hey, maybe we made a mistake in this kid's evaluation, he can play. But, a lot of people talk about, self-esteem, and I didn't have a lot of self-esteem when I was growing up, because people did look at me, and I would see pictures of myself. I was a skinny guy. 6'4", 145, and even when I was a senior in high school, I was 6'6", and I bulked up to 198. In fact, when I was getting recruited for college, and I got letters from everywhere because I was every all-state team. I made all the accolades in my senior year, and the college representatives would come to visit me at the high school, and they said, "You're not the guy we saw on film." I go, "Well, yeah, I am." They said, "No, you look like a basketball player." I said, "Well, no, that's me," and they would leave. So there was a lot of high interest on paper, but in reality, they just didn't think that, I had the physical side to play the sport of football. So that was a challenge from a perception standpoint. So you're a little self-conscious about that. And so I worked very, very hard in the beginning. I used to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I would go to high school on my own to go to the weight room to try and put on size and gain strength. I also, my mom, I ate 5 large meals a day. They really couldn't feed me enough. In fact, after the 8th grade football banquet we were at, I ate, 13 then, I think? I ate 28 pieces of chicken. And the only reason why I didn't eat more is that they ran out. So I had a voracious appetite, and I always did. And my mom used to make me in high school 5 sandwiches a day just to go ahead and supplement the meager lunch that they would serve you, because it was never enough. And so it would take me about an hour and a half to eat lunch, which was nice, because I got a chance to visit with a lot of people, because they would finish and leave and other people would come over. But so I had just this, I guess, inner drive that I really don't know where it came from, that a lot of people used to tell me, "No, you can't do that." And it had mostly had to do with sports. And I went quietly to myself and said, "Yeah, I can do that." And so that kind of developed through high school. And in fact, there's certain individuals who influence who you are as you grow up. One of them was Myrnie Lazier, who was my head coach in football as a senior on the varsity team and also lacrosse. And he was a very intuitive individual. And I noticed this because he had a test that you either had to bench press a certain amount of weight or you had to do a certain amount of push-ups. Well, I couldn't, or you couldn't play. Well, I couldn't pass either one of those tests. And between he and I, he made a concession for me because I think he noticed that I had a huge earnest to want to play and that I was very committed. And, he never really directly said to me that I'm going to let you play anyway, even though he didn't pass those tests. He just ignored the fact that I did not. And I obviously became one of his better players. And then was lucky enough to go ahead and get a scholarship to the University of Michigan, where I played for, a legendary coach in Bo Schembechler, who was a very difficult man to play for, but was fair to the point, and all his players will say this who played for him, is that he treated us as all the same. He said, well, they're all like dogs, so it didn't really matter. But if you could be successful in an environment that he presented, that he challenged you with, you basically can go ahead and take those fundamentals and apply them to life and be successful in life. Had the same with the offensive line coach there at the time, Jerry Hanlon, who was a short little Irishman who was extremely passionate, screamed and yelled, even cried, but laughed with you too and was very supportive, but challenged you. So fortunately, not only in high school through Murray Lazier, but in college with Bo Schembechler and then my offensive line coach, Jerry Hanlon, I think those three individuals basically created my foundation for success moving forward, because they challenged you to go the extra mile by telling you that the only thing that's keeping you from being successful is you, nobody else. And I accepted those realities and applied them, and obviously, what has occurred since then is speaks for itself. They took a chance at me in Michigan. I actually bulked up to 207 pounds when I finally reported, and I didn't sign a letter of intent to go to college until 6 weeks after the fact. And in fact, I hadn't been offered a scholarship by any school, even though I probably gotten 50 letters from colleges. And my parents couldn't afford to send me to college. So my student advisor, and I think Mike Murney had a relationship with the University of Cincinnati, and I got a late visit down there, and they loved me, and they offered me a scholarship on the spot, but I hated the place. I thought it was awful. But I knew my parents couldn't afford to send me to college, and I said, I either have to go ahead and accept this scholarship here, I'm not going to school, or I say no, and then I'll have to go to like junior college or something like that, and that's just the way it is. And I ended up luckily saying, no, I'd like to go ahead and talk to my parents about this. And I didn't want to disappoint them, but I could tell instinctively that this would be the wrong decision. So reflecting back on it now, I realized that intuition is a very important component of who you are and how you make decisions. And I think a lot of people make mistakes when they ignore what their intuition is on a given situation. They'll see the money or they'll see the prize, but they got a bad feeling in their stomach. If they decide to go ahead and take it, it's the wrong thing to do, but they'll do it anyway. So their priorities are out of whack. But I went back home, and I didn't want to disappoint my parents because I knew they couldn't afford to send me to college. And I went back and I said, Dad, I'm sorry. They offered me a scholarship. I couldn't take it. I said, you know, I just didn't like the place. I knew it wasn't a good fit for me. He said, son, that's okay. He says, if I have to go to junior college, that's what I'll do. And he says, son, whatever you do, I'm going to support you. I think back when I was in college, you were able to give 20 scholarships a year. No, 25 actually. So we had 100 total. And if I remember correctly, there were only 12 scholarship athletes from my freshman class that finished at Michigan, because 13 of them left. It was hard. In fact, there was a sign up above the door, on a lot of the doors that they put up there, those who stay will be champions. And one day and a lot of them were offensive linemen. Someone crossed out champions because so many guys were leaving, those who stay will play. And it was hard. I mean, before that, they used to give like 160 and 180 scholarships, and they would run players off to get down to 120. And even Bear Bryant did that. And in fact, when I was coming out of high school, there was a book that was just written called Meat on the Hoof. And one of the coaches in it was Frank Cush from Arizona State, and the other one was the Texas coach. I can't remember his name. Darrell Royal, maybe? Maybe Darrell Royal. Yeah. And I read that book just before I started to get recruited and make visits. And this will lead into a story. And one of the things I read about Arizona State was one of those schools that, gave 180, 200 scholarships knowing that they would run them off. And they had a mountain there that they referred to as Cush's Mountain. And then if you screwed up in practice, you had to run the mountain. And it wasn't a little mountain, it was a big mountain. And you had to run it to the top and bring it back down. And they painted Frank Cush as to be a maniac. And I got recruited by ASU, Arizona State, and Arizona. And I actually did make a trip to Arizona. And then the next weekend I was supposed to go to Arizona State. So I asked the players who were, I would guess, my chaperones, at the time. He says, I just got done reading this book, Meat on the Hoof, and, they'd say some pretty disparaging things about Frank Cush. Oh, yeah, they're all true. So have they invited you for a visit? Yeah, they have. Oh, you don't want to go there. And, they confirmed whether it was truthful or not. I canceled my trip to ASU. But another life lesson that I didn't know was a lesson at the time occurred from this. So Arizona didn't offer me a scholarship either at the time. And as I told you earlier, no one had offered me a scholarship, and they had arranged a visit for the University of Cincinnati, and I had turned them down. So I was sitting at home, not going to college. And then all of a sudden I got a phone call from the gentleman who was recruiting me at Arizona and said, Mike, we've decided that we want to offer you a scholarship to University of Arizona. And I really liked Arizona. I mean, first time I'd ever been on an airplane was flying down to University of Arizona in the middle of February, got off the plane with my winter coat in my hand, walking down the steps, not on the jetway, with girls with flowers and halter tops, and it's 82 degrees out. I said, there's something right about this picture. Had a great time, loved the university, loved the desert, liked everything about it, but they didn't offer me a scholarship. So when they called and offered me a scholarship, I was ecstatic. He says, but all right, will you accept? I said, yes, I'll accept it. And I says, you have to promise me that you're giving me your word that if you accept this scholarship, that you will keep it. I said, absolutely, no problem. I give you my word. I'm going to keep this scholarship. He says, all right, I'm getting on the plane to fly to Chicago right now. I'll call you when I get on the ground. You can tell me how to get to your house. And I said, okay, great, no problem. And hung up the phone. And my mom's sitting there, my dad's at work. And she said, what happened? And I told her, and she was just ecstatic. And I was ecstatic too. I said, wow, great. You know, it was my second choice. I always wanted to go to Michigan for some reason. I don't really know the affinity for it, but they had both a great football program and great academics. But I was ecstatic about Arizona as a second choice. So about 3 hours later, the phone rings. And it's Michigan, and it's Coach Schembechler on the phone. And he calls me Ken, and he did that to everybody. He calls you by your last name and doesn't start calling you by your first name until you leave. So he goes, Ken, we want to offer you a scholarship to the University of Michigan. And I was like, well, do you want to come to Michigan? Well, there's a problem. What do you mean there's a problem? We're offering you a scholarship to the University of Michigan. You don't want to be a Michigan Wolverine? I go, and I'm hesitating. I'm going, holy crap. I just gave my word for the first time in my life. I'm 18 years old. And then my instincts kicked in and said, yes, Bo, I'll take that. Yes, I want to come to Michigan. I'll take that scholarship. All right, congratulations and everything like that. And I hung up the phone. I looked at my mom, and I think I had my tears. Mom, I think I made a mistake. I just broke my word. And it devastated me. And for a long time, I didn't know if I had made the right decision. And then I figured it out. I figured it out that, big-time college football is a business. And once I got into it, why did Arizona, because the head coach at Arizona was a former defensive coordinator at University of Michigan. And why did they make me promise to go ahead and keep this scholarship? Well, I found out later, they had found out that Michigan was going to offer me the scholarship. So they tried to usurp Michigan, put the pressure on an 18-year-old to go ahead and make him promise something, which I still to this day think is not an appropriate way to act. And so I had regrets about it for a little bit, but then finally got over it, recognized it was just part of the business side of college football. And obviously my intuition was correct because my career at Michigan and subsequent career in the NFL speaks for itself. I don't know if that had turned out that way at Arizona. So, but yeah, that was, and my dad told me, don't worry about it, son. Here's what he says, Dad, I said, Dad, I broke my word. He said, son, why did you make that decision? He says, because Dad, I thought it was the right decision for me to make. He says, then it probably was, and you'll be fine. And he was right. My dad was something that's missing in society now, is that he was a quiet leader. The way that he raised us as children is that he was the kind of parent that was very watchful over his children, but he wasn't intrusive. He kind of looked over your shoulder to make sure that what you were doing, that you weren't going to harm yourself, or what you were doing was going to harm somebody else. But he would let you fail on a regular basis and then ask you, what did you learn? In fact, I would go to him and say, Dad, this is what I'm thinking about doing. What do you think? He said, well, son, he says, if I were you, this is what I would do. And these are the reasons why I think this is what should be done. He says, but you go ahead and you make your own decision. But remember, whatever decision you make, whatever consequences come with this, come with that decision. And, there were many times where, I disregarded the advice of my dad, and the consequences that he laid out were exactly what they were, but he didn't stop me from doing it. So I learned early on from him, and in the appropriate way that he tutored us, is that you need to go ahead and learn how to deal with failure and the consequences of that. What I also learned from him is that, in fact, I actually have an issue with the word failure. I actually think that the more appropriate description is that I was unsuccessful. And it has to do with the intent behind the decision or the action that you take. And I told both my girls this, and I've talked to young people about this, is that as long as your intentions are appropriate, meaning that you've done all the due diligence, you've done the research, you've made your assessments, and you've concluded that this is the action that you're going to take for the desired outcome that you believe it will achieve, and you move forward with that decision and you're unsuccessful in doing that, you haven't failed. You've just been unsuccessful. And people would ask, what do you mean I haven't failed? I did fail. I wasn't successful. I said, no, look at your intent behind it. You did everything you thought was appropriate. You did all your research. Your intentions were good, but you didn't anticipate something that you didn't know about. There was an outside influence that you couldn't control. There's something that was unknown to you that you couldn't factor in. So that's not failure. That's just, you not knowing certain aspects. So what you need to do is find out, is remember that. And when you're ever in that situation again, make sure you applied what you learned to that unsuccessful event to make sure that it doesn't repeat itself. The only time that I think that you're really a failure is when you've done something, you make a decision that you know is malicious, that where you're trying to manipulate people, you're trying to cause harm, and that speaks to the quality of the person, because you're not doing it with the right intentions. You're doing it, for adverse reasons. So that's what I learned from my dad, and that's what I kind of took into my life. And I also realized that the way that I was brought up and the challenges that I was faced with from being a very skinny young man, trying to be successful in sports. And I played every sport as a youth, from baseball to hockey to, was good at some, I was always a little bit better at football, is that there aren't really problems in life, there's really just challenges. And a lot of people get so weighted down on when they're faced with a circumstance that they can't find a solution from. And what they have to recognize is that, sometimes solutions aren't readily apparent. There's like, oh, I got a problem and here's the fix. Well, it's a work in progress sometimes. Sometimes they are. I said, okay, here's the problem, here's the solution, next question. Well, I got a problem. He says, well, what's the solution? I don't know yet, but I'm going to get there. He says, I'm going to go ahead and mitigate it, and I'm going to manage that problem until I go ahead and find a solution for it. And you don't know how long that process is going to take, but you will eventually get there. Now, I've got some problems that I'm still managing now. I've been managing for years, but I'm still confident that one of these days that I'll go ahead and identify a solution for them to eliminate that problem. But I'm not going to go ahead and wait that down, because problems are just the next challenge in your life, and you don't know when they're going to present themselves to you, and they're going to present themselves to you every day. So you have to accept that reality. That's just part of life, because there's no way in the world that we're ever going to be able to anticipate them, and that's just the thing. So when you accept that, and in fact, both my girls and my wife, they call me the fixer, because I'm always very calm in the face of a crisis. And that might have to do a little bit with football, and maybe with the position that I played, is that, as an offensive lineman, in football in general, as a player, there's 60 to 70 plays a game, and they happen every 45 seconds. So if you make a mistake that has consequences on the game, you've got to deal with that mistake, and you've got to be ready to go ahead and play the next play within 45 seconds. I can't dwell on that failure, or I can't dwell on that mistake. If I do, basically, it's going to affect the remainder of the game. And that mistake could be in the first play, 10th play, 20th play. It could be the 55th play with only 10 plays left in the game. and you can't let that affect your performance the rest of the time period. So that's something that I think I learned from football. Dealing with a crisis is that you've got to go ahead and mitigate it. You got to manage it immediately to go ahead and move on to the next thing. If you don't, you've got a problem. So got through college, graduated on time. Again, was a little bit better than everybody else, and was lucky enough to be drafted in the first round of the 1978 draft and 13th pick by the Atlanta Falcons. Really didn't have any aspirations at any time in my life to play professional football. I liked the sport, I liked the competition, I liked the camaraderie with the team, and I like to compete. I think it's innate in my personality. You know, I like to compete. And so, you know, I embraced the opportunity to be a professional football player and the challenges that came with it. And maybe that goes back to the challenges I faced in my youth, is that, all right, you know, someone entrusted me their opinion that I deserved to be the 13th pick in the draft. One, I don't want to disappoint them. And two, I don't want to disappoint myself. And then three, I want to go ahead and show everybody that I could be successful. Not because I wanted their endearment or their praise, but more, I mean, or even their adulation. I just wanted to show them, not in a boastful way, because that's not my personality. And I ended up having a 17-year career in the NFL. But there was a difference between the professional football and there was on the amateur side, which is in college athletics. You're an amateur in college, which means, you know, everything's an elective. You can choose to do it or not. But when you become a professional, now it's a job. Now you're getting paid to do something. Now it's a way of life. It's your way of life. It's how you're going to make an income, and that's how you're going to support your family. In fact, I won't tell you the long story, but you know, my wife tried to pressure me into marrying her before I got drafted, because we dated since my sophomore year in college. But I told her, I said, honey, I'm not going to ask you to marry me until I have a job and know that I can support you financially. She gets it now, but it didn't play that well then. But then after I got drafted, we got married after my rookie year, and we've been married ever since. It's like 37 years now. One of my teammates who I ended up playing with for 9 years, Jeff Van Note, who was already there for 9 years, was involved with the Players Association. And he said, you know, you should, he liked me, fellow offensive lineman, and he said, you know, you should consider, you know, getting involved with the Players Association. And I thought about it, and I said, you know, he's absolutely correct. I said, you know, I don't want to rely on other people to tell me what is or is not affecting my working conditions and my viability in accordance with this business relationship we had, employer-employee. So, and I've never been an individual who likes to sit in the background. I want to be in the game. I want to be on the field. I want to be a direct participant, because not that I'm distrustful of other people, but I know my evaluation and my assessment is going to be honest and sincere, and I can't necessarily say that for everybody else. So if I'm going to be comfortable with all the aspects around my employer-employee relationship, I need to get involved on the association side. So I ran for alternate rep, got elected by my teammates, ran for player rep, got elected as player rep, got elected by the player reps onto the executive committee at NFLPA. And then the circumstances changed a little bit. We had been through two strikes, 1982, which was a long and hard strike, and also one in 1987 while I was on the executive committee. They played substitute games, or scab games that we called them at the time. And up until that point, well, they started to talk to me about running for president of the NFLPA. And up until that point, it had been a position of very high mortality, which means if you got elected as president of the NFLPA, your basically career was over in about a year. They would trade you to another team and say that you lost a step, and all of a sudden you were walking the street. So there were 2-year terms, and nobody had run, in fact, in my tenure, had been president for more than one term, 2-year term. And we were out at our annual meeting, and they were talking to me about it, and I had become pretty much a leader within the executive committee. And I went and talked to my wife, Joni, and I said, Joni, if I agree to go ahead and do this, there's some potential consequences, adverse consequences that could come with this. And I laid it out there, and she says, well, what do you think? I said, well, be honest with you, I actually think it'll motivate me more to play at a high level. He said, I need a little bit more stimulus to make sure that I keep my game up there. So if they want to get rid of them, I'm going to make it really, really difficult for them to do that. And so I decided to do it, and knowing fair well that I could be completely wrong and that I was going to end my career. And that would have been about 11 years into it, I think, at that time. But I was still considered one of the top tackles in the game, and I became president and ran and won for 4 successive terms, so for 8 years. What I learned during my 8 years as president of the NFLPA was learning how to deal with multiple personalities and also different agendas. Football players are type A personalities in general, and having type A personalities, they have a tendency to be very opinionated and vocal. The executive committee, which is a smaller version of what the player reps are more an advisory and a steering committee, but when the actual votes are taken on policy, it's taken by the player reps. So the interaction between the executive committee, the president, and the executive director and the staff is more frequent than it was with the player reps. But it was always a challenge to go ahead and convince the player reps what we believed was the appropriate course of action. And this all had to take place within a 3-day period with our annual meeting. And there are always little different factions out there. There was our executive director was Gene Upshaw, who I hired in '82 while I was on the executive committee. They were pro-Gene, and then there was the anti-Gene. And so we knew where we wanted to get to. We didn't know how long it was going to take us to get to that point, or when it was the appropriate time to call for the vote, thinking that we would have the votes or not have the votes. And that's when, I learned how to manage personalities. I never held anybody's opinion against them because it was their opinion. They had the right to have that opinion. And just because I might disagree with that opinion doesn't mean I shouldn't like the person. Hey, it's their opinion, and that's their God-given right to have that opinion. I have a different point of view, and I'm going to try to go ahead and convince them in an appropriate way that they should change theirs, because this is going to be in their best interest, where I think theirs might be adversarial, but I'm never going to go ahead and hold that opinion against them. And I think that helped me very much on the Fulton County Board of Commissioners too, because there were some very unique personalities on that commission. And even though they would say some disparaging things to my face about policy or me personally, or say it in another public venue, I never held it against them and really didn't care what they thought about me. I was just trying to go ahead and advance what I thought was in the best interest of Fulton County. Same thing I was trying to do at the NFLPA. So at the end of the day, the only requirement that I asked for, and they always did adhere to it, is that once we finally take a vote, we're all in this together. And he says we all have to speak from the same voice, because if we break into factions, I said the league will use that against us and try and divide us. And maybe that comes from Bo Schembechler, because I think if anybody who follows college football remembers Bo, what he continually reinforced with us is that it's not the individual who is most important. And nobody's more important than the team. It's the team, it's the team, it's the team. And so I've always been a very team-oriented guy. And I was able to apply those principles in my work with the NFLPA, is to work with those different personalities and make sure everybody's keeping their eye on the ball, on, what our goal was and where we were going to get there and how we were going to get there. Not all at once, but incrementally, but slowly go ahead and make progress. Because it's like I tell my girls, I says, you would like there to be a straight line between A and B, but there's not. It's actually a jagged line. In fact, sometimes you're moving in the wrong direction. But if you believe that you'll eventually go ahead and find yourself back on the right path, you'll actually get to B. You just got to believe that fact. But as things are presented to you, you got to react to them appropriately, maintain your principles, listen to your intuition. You'll eventually get to point B. As long as you maintain your integrity in the process, you'll get there. So I didn't know this at the time, but I got lucky. So I think I got lucky with my owner, Rankin Smith, and he's been very disparaged. In fact, when they had a ceremony honoring my retirement the year after I retired, the fans, he presented me with my jersey, and they booed him unmercifully, and he really couldn't hear what he was saying. I could. I was on the field. He made a statement there which was one of the greatest statements that someone ever said about me in general. He praised me for what I did on the football field, but what he said was that what Mike Kenn should be most remembered for is not only he did for the community, but what he did representing the players of the National Football League as president. And then I recognized, I said, what he understood, contrary to other owners like a Hugh Culverhouse or a Leon Hess or something like that, is that it was maybe my first political lesson in business, is that the Players Association and the Players Union was not going to go away. You weren't going to be able to kill them. He says they were a necessary component to the relationship owner and player. And he never held it against me personally for the leadership role that I took in order to represent the players' interests. He just knew it was part of business. And that was really a profound statement on his part. And I didn't realize that he thought that until he actually made it at my retirement ceremony. But I had developed the courage then to, one, recognize what the consequences were, but I wasn't afraid of the failure that would be associated with it. Because, as I kind of touched on earlier, my intuition told me it was the right thing to do. Not just for me, but for everybody else that I was involved with. And I followed my intuition on that, even though I didn't know what the consequences would be in the future. And luckily, one, did it for the right reasons. Two, my intuition was correct. And there weren't any negative consequences associated with that. So after I retired from the NFL, and I was fortunate enough to go ahead and exit walking, as I call it, I wanted to, since I played for so long, I wanted to finish on the field. I didn't want to be riding the bench because I had never been on the bench. I started every game I played in from the very first preseason game as a rookie. And I wanted to finish on the field, the ballot, which means on the last game I wanted to wave to the crowd and walk off, and I was able to do that. I'm probably, very few NFL players get to do that. The decision's usually made for them. Either one, they're replacing you with somebody better, or two, your career is cut short by injury. I was one of the lucky ones who got to choose when I retired. So, my wife and I kind of explored the normal societal options from a charitable standpoint. After I retired, starting, a charity and how could we give back to the community that had been so good to us, for the 17 years. And I'd always kind of paid attention to what was going on politically because I cared about the community, and I also was being watchful of my community. And I wanted to make sure that people were making decisions that were in not only my best interest, but the community's best interest. And I was at a fundraiser for, I think it was Commissioner Bob Fulton, and started to talk with Bob about issues. And I think it was very eye-opening on his part. And he was really kind of amazed that I was kind of up to speed on as many things that I was from a local standpoint. I guess they had some conversations afterwards. One of the people I know was involved was Mark Burkhalter, and they approached me to run for commission of Fulton County, the commission chairman of Fulton County. One, I was flattered, and two, I'd never really considered it. And I said, well, you need to give me some time to evaluate this and think about it. And I did, and spoke with my wife about it. And I said, honey, I don't consider myself a politician. I hope that I never become a politician. He says, because I think this is a way for me to do something on a grander scale. I had recognized that all politics is basically local, because 95% of the political decisions that are made at the local level, and those are the ones that are going to affect you most. It's basically standard constituent services, quality of life services. And I said, honey, I think if I run for this, and I know there's going to be some adversity associated with it, I know that, they're going to try to paint me as something that I'm not, and there's going to be some bad things said about me that I don't want it to reflect on you, and I don't want it to reflect on our girls who were young at the time. But I think that this is the best way for me to probably do something on a grander scale, to have a positive impact on the community that we have made our home. So I decided to run, and I was successful and got elected. Well, it was everything I thought and more. So there are a lot of things that happened. I have no regrets. I don't believe I turned into a politician. In fact, I know I didn't. I made all the decisions that I made that I thought were in the best interest of the constituency that supported me. I wasn't afraid to disagree with someone. I didn't buy any votes. People used to come up to me and say, Mr. Chairman, he says, if you don't support this issue for our community, he says, we're going to pull our support for you. And I says, well, that's all well and good, but I think that if I take your position, it's actually going to adversely affect your community, even though you think to the contrary. In good conscience, I can't support something that I truly believe is going to be harmful to you, even or not. So if you want to pull your support for me, go right ahead. But I'm here basically to do the right thing, what I think is in the best interest after I've made my evaluation, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's what I did. So I stuck to my principles and to my convictions. And I think it goes all the way back to the challenges again when started in grade school. I was a tall, skinny kid that was always told no. And I learned how to go ahead and succeed, and wasn't afraid to fail. Wasn't afraid of the consequences of being unsuccessful. Focused on what the intention was and what the goal was. And then always hoped that I had done the proper evaluation in order to be successful in achieving that goal. Recently, I'm at the end of a 6-year startup company that three of us started, myself, an associate of mine up in Minneapolis, and a friend of mine out in LA, where I'm the president and CEO. We have a product that solves funding in healthcare and pension trusts. Took us about 6 years to get to this point, and we're finally, as they say, at the leaping off point, and it's starting to happen. So the next 2 years are going to be pretty exciting for us. And then the wife and I are starting to discuss on, where we want to live the rest of our lives. We've been empty nesters for a while. One girl's in Arlington in Washington, D.C. The other one's downtown. She'll be 29 in December. The other one will be 25 in February. Where do we want to be? I don't want to be up north in the cold. It's too cold. I'm not going back there. I'll go in the summer. Do we want to stay here in Atlanta and keep a place here? We really like the Panhandle of Florida. We used to have a home down there on the beach. We both want to get back there, but how much time, if we did that, would we spend down there? So we're starting to have those discussions, and hopefully they'll mature and be realized, next year sometime, late next year. So that's kind of where we're at. Trying to still play golf when I can. If you want to simplify it, it's basically you got to follow your heart, and then usually if you do that, you won't be wrong. And you got to recognize that challenges come at a daily basis, just like driving down here in the traffic today. You got to start early so you're not late, which I did. Really, that's the way that I've conducted myself, all the way through my life, and recognize too that there are still many things to come, and there are many decisions that are going to have to be made, because as long as you're upright and breathing, that's just the way the world works. So, where am I going from here? Not sure.